Hey y'all, you're listening to Risky Behavior, where no subject is off limits. Sit back, tune in, and enjoy a beverage with us as we explore controversial issues and answer your health and wellness related concerns, ranging from nutrition and exercise to sex and prescription drugs. I'm here with co-host Dr. Shetha Chakraborty, who's a national media risk expert, as seen on CNN, the BBC, Fox News, and more.
But don't just think this hour is all science as usual. After 4 seasons as a regular guest and food scientist on the Dr. Oz Show, Dr. Taylor Wallace, who the Huffington Post calls the nation's premier food and nutrition guru, together we will loosen lips and spill tea with special guests that you will not want to miss. So, let's jump right into our guest this week, who's a dear friend. She also happens to be the president of IGES, the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And she's been involved in her career, a long career in science and communications, and she's driven by her love for nature. That's truly where this is all coming from.
Exactly.
So why don't you start us off and tell us exactly what IGES is and what you all do?
Well, thanks. And thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and this
Again?
is always so much fun. Again, yes.
A recurring guest.
Yeah. So the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies is a small nonprofit in Arlington, Virginia. And what we do is we help to promote knowledge about the planet and how we can better understand the changing planet by primarily using space technologies. So we work with, we're very lucky, since I had founded IGES 25 years ago, we've worked primarily with NASA, NOAA, the National Science Foundation, and others. And so NASA is our largest client, and you know, there are a number of satellites that look at the Earth, all aspects of the Earth, and then we try to take that information, get it into classrooms, help people better understand the science, and more importantly, try to understand how it helps U.S. business.
So we had a friend of yours on the show, episode 5 for listeners who want to go back and hear more.
Yeah.
Bill Clanky.
Bill Clanky on my board.
Yes.
Great guy.
He's on Nancy's board, and he told us so much about NASA. Give us, I don't think listeners will make the connection between NASA automatically, NOAA, and conservation. Mm-hmm. How do these things kind of, how does this landscape pan out?
Yeah. Well, as you know, NASA has a number of satellites that circulate the Earth all the time, and some of them are geostationary, just look at special spots, but they build the weather satellites, and then, of course, they transfer them to NOAA, and NOAA operates the weather satellites that help us better understand extreme, not only weather events, but long-term climate implications and all of that. But NASA is really the premier science agency in looking at carbon in the atmosphere. We were just talking before the show started about deforestation, but looking at using the Landsat programs and other satellites that can look over time at forests, and now using artificial intelligence start to determine where there might be fires, where there might be illegal logging. I mean, we're getting so good at our techniques that we can determine where there are a number of things.
That's so cool, because Donald Trump thinks NASA is literally just Space Force.
Right.
Without realizing the critical function that it plays for really just examining our terrestrial Earth.
Well, right. And it's a good example of how a technology can really help us predict the future, right? Because we can see the amount of deforestation, we can see the amount of greenhouse gas buildup, and so when scientists make those predictions, that we're going to have to change things in the next 10 years, I don't think people realize it's based on really hard data that come out of these really credible scientific agencies.
And Nancy, having you here is such a delight. I'd love to get your views on what have you seen change. You have been working in this space for 25 years plus, right?
Yeah.
And so what have you seen in the ways of conservation? Many of our listeners give us regular feedback that they're scared that we are losing forests, we're losing green plant life, all of that, but also species, right? The dire predictions is that we're going to be losing up to 1 billion, something like that. Or what are the numbers?
Yeah. Well, let me just back up a little bit, because I think a really good example of space technologies and data science really has come out of what's happened in Australia recently. and the bushfires that happened there, where we had 18 million
Devastating.
hectares, 44 million acres, 28 people died, 3,000 homes, and over 1 billion animals lost.
Yeah, I
estimated
saw
to be
on
lost.
Facebook the kangaroos that they were all trying to save. It was so sad.
It is so sad. But one of the things that has come out of that is looking at why wasn't this predicted? Why didn't we recognize that the characteristics were there that would lead to these bushfires? And what they found is that many of the models weren't identifying something like that, a fire of that magnitude or a bushfire of that magnitude take place for another 80 years, And so I think what's come out of that is really looking at our models and saying, are they matching where we are right now, the science? And so I think that, we have observational technologies, we have a lot of data. It's how we use that data to make the best decisions and to give us the best information and forecasting.
Okay. No, so that's fascinating. Now, what does that mean for future predictions? So you're saying that we need to revamp some of this to be able to better predict potential outcomes?
Right. I think we have to do a better job at investing in forecasting. All eco forecasting, our weather forecasting is great. Our climate forecasting is getting much better.
Right.
But I believe that, we have tons of data. Are we really using it? And so that's where AI, the machine learning comes in to help us better, to train computers to pick up on things, to alert our policymakers and our leadership and government that, look, these are going to be the problems. If you're running a business, could you imagine running a business right now and having to deal with the kinds of temperatures that we're dealing with?
Right.
The kinds of air quality we're going to have. How do you build something in China when the air quality is so bad?
Well, and I was even, on the news the other day, I was looking at imaging of algae blooms because in the Gulf, fertilizer runoff from the Mississippi has really caused these intense algae blooms that happen almost seasonally now, and we can monitor that through this satellite imaging.
So what everything you're referring to is so critical in preserving, right? Ultimately, this is the point, is to preserve what we already have. But then also, is it possible to even do that now with everything, all the changes you've witnessed through your career, just in terms of the trends of a warming planet, increased deforestation, all of these?
I believe we're doing it. I think we can do it better. And I think that as awful as, and the bushfires are awful, I think the piece that came out on Monday about the fact that, look, the models weren't even addressing a situation like this for another 40 years, or 80 years rather, 80 years.
Yeah.
That should be a message to the science community. And as they were saying, there's a crisis in science right now. And it's not just a crisis for the planet. It's a crisis for science because we've got to make sure it works for us.
Well, and while the U.S. Department of Agriculture continues to hide data on climate change, we should be investing in these types of technologies to be able to identify the problem before it happens.
Right. And, I think one of the big trends we're seeing as well is there's a lot of money being invested in commercial companies that are also going to be providing high resolution data, synthetic aperture radar, all of those kinds of new instrumentations or new capabilities, that it's not going to just be the government programs anymore, although the government programs are really kind of like, how it is when you start using a technology or a data set or whatever, you continue to use it. I think it's going to be hard to do a switch, and especially if companies can't show that they're going to be in the business for the long term. But there is an incredible investment being made right now in Earth observations technologies. There's even more of an investment and I think an opportunity in the artificial intelligence, or machine learning, whatever you want to call it. It's interesting, I grew up in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. And I was thinking about, in preparation for the show, when I was a kid, 4 years old, the very first house we had was in a place called Duquesne, Pennsylvania. Like most houses outside of Pittsburgh, you have your house and overlooks the steel mill. And I remember as a kid, I would be afraid to go outside because all the smoke plumes would come up, from the mills, and they would make these big figures in the sky. And I always thought they were monsters. And in some respects, I was right. They were monsters. And they were putting some bad stuff into the air we breathe. And, I think that's where I first started. I think of that as like my first connection to wanting to understand what's going on, or understanding that, is it a monster? Is it not a monster? How do we change?
Because also, Pennsylvania is one of the most beautiful. As somebody who grew up in New Jersey and went to Carnegie Mellon,
Yeah.
so I would drive from New York, New Jersey to Pittsburgh
Yeah.
every few weeks, and that drive, especially through the fall, is just so stunning.
It is so pretty.
So it's
yeah.
a stark contrast when you see the beauty that is nature, that is Allegheny, right? Is the
Yeah,
river
the
and
Allegheny, the three
yeah,
rivers,
and
the
just
Monongahela,
right,
the Allegheny,
right.
the Ohio,
and just how
and the Pittsburgh Steelers.
yeah, I was there when they won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, baby.
That's like the most sporty thing I think I've ever said on the show.
I think that is definitely the most sporty thing you've ever. I'm surprised you
you.
knew who the Pittsburgh Steelers were.
Yeah.
It's because I happened to be there in 2005 when they won, and it was a big deal. No, but so that stark contrast, right? The beauty
Yeah.
that is nature, and then seeing most of what's going on in terms of pollution, in terms of destroying the natural environment, is naked to or invisible to the naked eye, right?
Yeah.
So when you actually see it, like you just described, that contrast is jarring.
Well, and there's a lot of conflict, right? I mean, the fact that that Pittsburgh, I mean not Pittsburgh, but Pennsylvania is such a beautiful state, and yet it's a state that there's a lot of fracking going on right now. It has not a great economy, so people look for business. West Virginia is the same way with the coal. So I think what I see right now is that there's still this challenge of how do you balance environment with economy.
Right.
That's something we haven't quite found. There was a big uproar this week that the World Bank was putting money into African countries where they were supporting the oil and gas business.
Right.
That's not cool. It's just not cool.
So you're saying, though, that this commercial investment you referred to, you think will preserve what we already have? Can we turn the tide on it? Or are we already kind of locked in?
I'm not sure I understand your
So
question.
the question is conservation, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that we want to preserve the natural environment as much as possible. Is there any way to kind of turn it around? Can we get back some of what we lost?
The Conference on Biodiversity under the UN is certainly trying to help us better understand and help us create more parks and protected areas around the world, so that we can protect biodiversity. So not just terrestrial, but also marine.
Right.
And so there are lots of efforts underway that will help us do that. And part of the big problem we have is migrating species.
Right.
So we have to make sure that we can begin to work with all of these parks and have connectivity between them, so
Right.
those migrating species have a place to go.
Can we monitor that using technology? Migrating species? Are we that technologically advanced?
I mean, you can use high resolution data to see the wildebeest migrations in Africa, for example.
Oh,
That's
wow.
really cool.
I had no clue.
And in fact, I have an image I can send to you that's really wonderful. It's a high resolution image of the wildebeest.
Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's really, really
From
neat.
them.
Can I say something controversial?
Go for
Never.
it.
Since we're talking
Not
about
you.
love and nature and all of it. Okay, can we just let some of these things go? So I remember a few years back, I was at a conference, and I'm not going to say her name, but she's a scientist with Natural Resources Defense Fund, NRDC. And she's known as kind of like the fish lady. And she said at this it was a conservation meeting, and she said, you know what, we just need to let some of these species go. And everybody in the room was shocked that somebody who is all about, it's a conservation conference, ideas, how do we mitigate against, how do we preserve, and how do we reduce the amount of harm that's being done to the natural and the marine environment. And she was like, honestly, the amount of money we're putting into trying to protect some species is resulting in overall harm across the board. So we need to recognize that we just need to let some of them go, and we need to turn our attention to the ones that we can actually, through investment and resources, save, right? And so as much as we love the polar bears, it's somebody's pet project ultimately, or there's groups devoted to it, but ultimately some of them we just have to accept that it might not be worth our while. And with the fish, genetically modified fish, that's when she brought that up, and she said, if we are not going to be able to save salmon, because if we think about the extinction rate for
Right.
wild salmon, let's just accept that and let's actually look
Yeah.
at how we can produce genetically modified salmon. That's
Well,
at
then
odds
who-
with the
who-
conservation community,
but
no?
who makes that choice? And if you're indigenous people, a person, and you have spent your life fishing for certain species on your in your area, who should make that choice for you?
Right.
You know, and especially if you don't have any control over the fact over what has happened to those species. So I think it's more of a question of who comes up with that holistic look at, okay, if we're going to save the planet, how do we do it? What's our strategy? What's our plan? And what falls by the wayside, right? I mean, that's kind of scary.
Well, it's really fascinating, the technology that we have, the surveillance technology that you're describing when it comes to monitoring, different species, or whether it's forest fires or deforestation or carbon dioxide levels, and we still don't get our own supply chains right. I mean, it's
Yeah.
also these communities are isolated, and we have all this technology that is absent in so many places throughout the world. It's almost sad.
Yeah. I think that in just talking, though, this is a really good example of kind of where I didn't want the discussion to go. Because when it comes to nature, when it comes to the beauty of our planet, when it comes to conservation, we tend to talk about the negative and not the positive. And I really think we need to turn the conversation around and think about not what's wrong with nature. Clearly, we have to address that, but we have to remind ourselves why we love it.
Okay, I appreciate that so much, Nancy.
As a behavioral scientist, I would hope so.
And it's true, because also the climate change issue that I'm addressing all the time with audiences that are resistant, and they're resistant to changing their behaviors and adapting and mitigating, because so much of the narrative is the negative without painting a picture of, okay, we don't have to talk about how painful it's going to be going forward and the restrictions we're going to have on our lifestyles. What we need to say is we need to look forward to a future that is cleaner. Imagine being outside and being able to breathe in air and not being worried if how long your children are on the playground. Paint a picture that is healthier and just more welcoming to our species.
I mean,
right?
all of the research shows that when you talk more with
Right.
positive messaging, there's a higher probability the message will be received. And of course, what am I telling you? You're a behavioral scientist.
No, but thank you for
PhD.
reinforcing that. That's exactly right.
And so I often go back and I think about the work that I've done with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, where I was involved in a leadership position with their Commission on Education and Communication, and we came up with this whole program about themes like it's love, not loss,
Right.
and really trying to touch people emotionally on conservation or nature rather than through science, because sometimes science people just shut down. But if I can talk to you about like when you were, what's your favorite experience in nature?
Well, I tell you, one of my favorite experiences
Keep
in
it
nature,
PG.
and this kind of adds to what you're saying, because right, it's all about education, particularly for the younger generations. I remember my AP biology teacher, Mr. Childs, in high school, was all about conservation, and at the time I kind of really took it for granted because I was a high school kid, and I thought about it the last time I was back in Kentucky, because he used to hand out these little pine trees like during conservation month, and you could take them and go plant them and stuff like that. And I drove by my old house. My parents no longer live in the house I grew up in, but I drove by, and now this pine tree is like like literally like 200 feet tall. I'm giving away my age here, but it's I kind of look back and I'm like, that's a pretty like cool experience. And I think if we can instill something like that early on in kids, I mean, every one of us, if we just do a little bit, we can make a really large impact.
One of the things that we did when with the IUC and the commission was that we started to ask people, when did you fall in love with nature, or how did you fall in love with nature? And invariably, people always talked about, well, it was my grandfather, it was my AP biology teacher, or I remember when my dad, I was one of 6 kids, and he'd like pack us up all in the car. We'd make sandwiches, put them in a cooler, and he'd take us to Keystone Park, because that's what you did with 6 kids. And, we just loved hanging out at the lake and running around and looking for stuff
So I think you're very on point with being positive about it, presenting it in that way, getting people excited, connecting people back to the nostalgic memories, and thinking about the future and them wanting to recreate that for their family. Do you see the conservation community doing that? Because I would say that you're really unique in terms of how you present this. The other groups that work in the space tend to really use fear mongering and really, the commercials on TV, like looking at your favorite stuffed animal in real life, like no longer being part of the future for your future children. How do you feel about the rest of the community and how they present it?
Well, I think like anything, it takes time. And I think most of the space is occupied by scientists, right? And scientists aren't comfortable
Right.
We're not
talking
the
about
most
emotional topics.
Well, they're not comfortable talking, period. And
Yeah,
we
a
should
lot of
be.
them, yeah. So when you start saying like, oh, love, it's about love, not loss, or it's nature for all, they're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
But I will tell you that I think what we see happening, at least with the International Union, with the conservation of nature, as we're leading up to our World Conservation Congress, which is going to happen in June, and all the major players are going to be there, whether Conservation International, National Geographic, and others. You are seeing a trend. You are seeing a trend to positive messaging, because we are beginning to realize that you can do the best job ever delivering the science, but if it's not touching you, if you're not feeling connected to that polar bear, or if you're not feeling connected to Denali Park, then it doesn't matter. The science is not going to sink in.
Right.
You're not going to embrace it.
Don't we need to prioritize, though? Because ultimately we do have limited resources, time, personnel, money, all of it, attention. Right. So how do we begin to, and you're right, who determines that? Because ultimately it's not distributed fairly. We know this. We know that those most vulnerable are suffering immediately the impacts of climate change more so than those that are much further removed, who are making the decisions that hurt those vulnerable communities, especially indigenous peoples that are that have set up communities along the coast. And they're seeing it firsthand more than other communities that maybe have figured out much more infrastructure to live. So in that sense, how do we, taking all of that, the morals and ethics into account, how do we think about prioritizing who and what we can actually do something for?
Well, I think that's where we look to organizations like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the UN Environment Program, the UN Development Program, and others, because as much as they've had leadership roles, their leadership roles are more important now than ever. And we have the technology to hear from more people than we ever had. And as we move forward, I think those organizations kind of have to recast themselves and come up with ways that they can be more efficient, can be more engaging, and really
I think we're more likely to curb climate change before that happens, but
I'm an optimist. I'm
talking
positive.
I just met Akim Steiner, who is the head of UNDP.
He's great.
They just launched Mission 1.5 in New York City, which is their game. It's actually a game. So it's really everything you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Using technology to really get to people in a way that is on target with how people interact now. Yeah. So everyone's on their phone. Everyone's playing Candy Crush. It blew my mind when I found out the amount of people, gaming industry has just blown up. And then it doesn't matter what age range you are. You probably are kind of fiddling around with a game on your phone. I personally don't. Do you?
No, but I tell you what, this little thing keeps popping up on my phone where there's a little guy, and you can either sizzle him with lava or you can put the water in, and you have to save him by pulling the little plugs out, and I never can save the asshole. I always burn him up, and I just hate it.
Okay, our producer is shaking his head. I also feel like Taylor kind of enjoys him getting thrown into volcanoes.
No, I really want to save him one time, and I never can.
But this is how people now engage.
Right.
This is how you get through to people. It's quick, it's immediate. We know TikTok is blowing up. People have 3 to 10 seconds maximum attention. So if the UN is getting creative like that, and they've actually collaborated now with tech companies. They've created a game that forces that gamifies climate change, that gamifies conservation.
Well, we're doing observations, citizen science observations using phones all the time, whether it's a bird counting or at IGES we work on a program called Globe Observer for NASA, where students, teachers, you can go out and look for a mosquito larvae and determine, what types of larvae are available or present rather. It might be Zika, those kinds of things, and then you can help with mitigating that in your community. So that's a really big deal. And again, it's all made possible through cell phones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so let's take advantage. I like how positive you are about the commercial space and the opportunities, the science and tech advances here.
Yeah.
We're coming up to a whole new era of conservation. We don't need to look at it in a negative way. We can actually talk about a future that is even better than anything we've experienced in the past.
So I think for our listeners, that are tuning into this episode, what can we all do? So, I'm busy, I'm at work, I know to recycle. What can I do? What are some small steps I can take to help the environment?
Well, you know what I would do? I would do something for you. I would get out in nature. I would go for a hike. I would reconnect with nature so that, it makes more sense to not use a straw. So it makes more sense not to go and buy, anything that's in, one-use plastic, or to get rid of those terrible, terrible garbage bags. Not garbage bags, but the store
One-use
bags.
plastic
No,
bags.
no, you're not one of those naturalists that run around naked at the campground, right?
On occasion. Depends what campground. But
Depends how much wine.
as I would say, though, but it's all about you as an individual. Once you connect or reconnect with nature, you're going to want to do a lot of things. You're going to want to talk to classrooms about being more protective of the planet. And that's all I would say, is just make sure that, you keep nature as part of you.
And I think you ended on a wonderful note. So that's all for today. Remember to check us out every week. Have ideas for the show? Tweet us at Dr. Taylor Wallace and at Shet the Sea. Thanks for tuning in to Risky Behavior. Until next time.